A little while ago, a friend and I got into a heated discussion involving the pause and play mechanic. This is where combat plays out in real time, but at any point you are able to pause to take a specific action, such as adjusting your movement, switching targets, or casting a spell. Now, I'm a big fan of this playstyle, but their stance was that it was inferior to both turn-based and action combat. So I will spend this video explaining the pros and cons to this admittedly niche genre, including my viewpoint on why I find it enjoyable and going over its various shortcomings. I think the biggest reason it's difficult to argue for the pause and play mechanic is because there aren't many flagship games in the genre to use as an example. The turn-based genre has Final Fantasy, the isometric RPG genre has Diablo. However, the few real-time with pause games that people can easily reference are the Elder Scrolls and the Fallout series. And I mean, sure, they do in fact make use of a pause feature, so it is technically real-time with pause, but that doesn't necessarily fit the topic of discussion. In the argument I'm referring to, I was defending games where you have a party, which basically limits us to a few isometric CRPGs and, Dragon Age Origins. Yeah, that's about it. But I'm not going to sit here and jerk this genre off all day, so I'm going to start with a massive glaring flaw with the pause and play mechanic. And that's that it pretty much limits a game to be exclusively single player. Any attempt at multiplayer just turns into a mess. That's not to say that it can't be done, but as of right now I haven't seen it implemented in a way that is fair or even competent for that matter. I'm sure there are some people who have their brains morphed together and are perfectly in sync at all times, but that's just not realistic by any stretch of the imagination. If you're playing a game where you not only have the ability, but it is a necessary core function of combat to pause, then it's going to be an absolute disaster trying to coordinate with another person. Having someone that needs to pause every 2 seconds is not enjoyable in a multiplayer experience. There are exceptions though. RTS and 4X games have these features. They work fairly well as long as the person you're playing with tells you. For example, Stellaris is a fantastic game to play with your friends, despite the fact that every time I would ask them very politely to say when they're pausing, they disregard my simple request, forcing me to anxiously check the top right corner of the screen like when you see a cop in the rear view mirror. I digress because that mini rant was fairly off topic, but you know who you are and you know what you did. Basically, the gist of what I'm getting at is that you can have a multiplayer action game and you can have a multiplayer turn-based strategy game, but real-time with pause is flawed by design when it tries to involve more than one person. That being said, I feel as though when it comes to an immersive single-player RPG experience, I have never felt more engaged in a combat scenario than when playing real-time with pause RPGs. Sure, action RPGs should feel more immersive because you can't just pause real life, but being able to change the pace and plan things out gives me a genuine satisfaction that is unparalleled. You can enter a battle with characters that seem weak and pathetic, and if you use them correctly, you'll be able to win engagements that should have never been deemed possible. However, this is a double-edged sword because when you enter an encounter in a real-time with pause game that is genuinely too difficult, then defeat is borderline unbearable. There are no excuses that you can give yourself. In an action game, you can blame a bad hitbox. In a turn-based game, you can blame bad RNG. But in a game with pause and play where you have all the time in the world to coordinate a perfect strategy and react with task-level maneuvers, the only one left to blame is yourself. Now, another thing that could be considered a flaw is the types of games that involve this style of combat. I, personally, am a huge fan of CRPGs, along with other genres that involve a grand scope and massive world, but I understand why other people don't like them. These games are dense, like tungsten dense. And if you're willing to give them the time and effort that these games deserve, then you're rewarded with some amazing content. There's some phenomenal writing, and the character development is superb. Unfortunately, this can become overwhelming at times. I have a terrible attention span, which leads to some major problems. At some point, I just stop caring. I've simply had enough. It doesn't matter how well thought out the story arc is. It doesn't matter how much I've grown fond of my companions. There's a threshold to how much reading I'm willing to partake in when playing a game, and once it's crossed, I'm officially done. I am no longer willing to dredge through a swamp of exposition. It's bad enough I had to learn all these new words because everybody wants to get fancy with their dialects and create crazy lore, but it's been 30 hours and I got other shit to do. Again, I applaud anyone who has written for these long RPGs, because some of you are truly in a masterclass of your craft. However, my little pea brain simply will not allow me to spend copious copious amounts of time trying to progress in a story that could just end up in a side quest where I have to consume more flavor text than alphabet soup. But as I stated earlier, the quality to quantity ratio is usually evened out, so I just try to be patient and stick with it, even though the ending somehow always ends up on a sour note. If you've never played a real-time with pause game, then I highly suggest Towers of Time, because it is completely carried by the tremendous use of pause and play, which is the only thing that kept me engaged throughout my playthrough. If you can finish that game, then you might realize that real-time with pause can be fun and engaging, even if it's not your preferred method of playstyle. For those of you who don't agree with me and think that the combat style is complete bullshit, then you're in luck. Due to similarities involving turn-based and real-time with pause, it seems like even games with the mechanic end up having an option for turn-based combat eventually. Obsidian officially added it to Pillars of Eternity 2 with its 5.0 patch, and Pathfinder Kingmaker had a mod for turn-based combat, which apparently has 68,000 downloads. Even though I think it's wonderful that players are able to enjoy the game however they see fit, I don't feel like these changes were necessary by any means, nor should developers be cornered into changing titles' entire gameplay loop just because players outright refuse to play a game involving real-time with pause. In Baldur's Gate 3, they will be implementing turn-based combat instead of the iconic pause and play that the games have been known for previously, and although this sparked a small outrage, it wasn't nearly as big as I thought it would be, because apparently I'm on the losing side of this argument, which is completely understandable. It's a Dungeons & Dragons game, and Dungeons & Dragons is turn-based. It just makes sense. Not to mention the exorbitant amounts of praise that the Divinity series garnered pretty much guarantees the Baldur's Gate franchise will continue to be a success even after switching to a turn-based combat gameplay loop. I still fully intend on playing the game regardless, but real-time with pause just works for me. Even though turn-based stays more true to the source material, I couldn't help but feel disappointed in the new direction, but that won't stop me from playing. If that's the way the developers want it to be, then I support that decision. I don't feel inclined to gather community members and try to strong-arm the developers into making a game how I want it to be. I enjoy the strategic weight of every decision in turn-based combat, and I embrace the chaos of action RPGs, but I find a euphoric sense of satisfaction from real-time with pause because it blends the best of both of those genres, in my opinion. In a turn-based game, minor battles feel like an absolute chore. You can end up spending a significant amount of time fighting a battle you are pretty much guaranteed to win, but will have to sit there literally going through the motions and waiting for your inevitable victory. Turn-based combat works best when the stakes are high and your party is actually in danger. Action RPGs are the exact opposite, where you can be an absolute god the entire game until you find that one boss that you get stuck on for an hour because of some gimmick or overpowered moveset, which can make the whole process tedious. Difficult bosses or mobs of enemies are completely fine in games that have a consistent learning curve. The dopamine rush of finally reigning victorious over particularly difficult battles is a wonderful sense of accomplishment, but I often find that ARPGs use this massive difficulty spike like a bait and switch to actively halt the player's progress. Now for me, real-time with pause makes every fight enjoyable, because if I enter a battle I know I'll win, I can literally hit the fast forward button, and if I'm fighting an enemy that would wipe my whole party, then I could take things as slow as I want and plan accordingly. I never feel cheated or that I'm wasting my time because this genre gives me the opportunity to control it. If I want to haphazardly charge into a battle with no strategy and let my party do all the work for me, hoping for the best, then I can. If I wanted to pause every 2 seconds to min-max, micromanage, and utilize every character to their full potential, creating what essentially is a turn-based combat game but even slower, then I can do that as well. While it might not be as quote-unquote tactical as turn-based or as flashy as an action RPG, real-time with pause provides the player with more options than either genre could, albeit through the sacrifice of other core features that otherwise would be available. At the end of the day, in my opinion, if you don't like the genre, then it's really not that big of a deal, because it's not for everyone. Not to mention that the exclusivity of real-time with pause games are still a fairly rare occurrence. I personally wish there were more, but you won't see me in turn-based strategy forums insisting that real-time with pause is better and demanding that the next Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy accommodates my preferences. Look, all I'm trying to say is that real-time with pause might be getting a bad rep. It seems like some people that are quick to dismiss the genre either haven't given it a fair shot or try to blow its flaws out of proportion, and I'm excited to see what the future holds when it comes to games that do implement the real-time with pause mechanic. And of course, I want to know what you think. If you have a strong opinion on either side of the subject, then please leave it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, then give give it a like. If you hate me and my opinion, then make a second YouTube account. That way you could leave 2 dislikes. If you want to hear various other topics in video games such as this one, feel free to subscribe. But above all, and most importantly, stay safe and have a nice day. Peace out.